Get started. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidil Anbiya wal Mursaleen. Muhammad bin Abdullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. اللهم اجعل اجتماعنا اجتماعا مرحوما وتفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما ولا تجعل منا فينا ولا منا ولا معنا شقيا ولا محروما. آمين. Should Islam be taught as a worldview as opposed to being taught as a religion only? This is the main idea our distinct speaker, Sheikh Fahad Tasleem, will be expounding in this session. Sheikh Fahad, mashallah, is a research fellow and an instructor at the Sapiens Institute. His research interests include the theophilosophy, Quranic studies, Dawah, Islamic and comparative theology and Arabic linguistic. Mashallah, Sheikh Fahad studied Arabic at Georgetown University. He completed the Middle Eastern Studies graduate program at the University of Texas in Austin with a focus on Islamic theology. Mashallah, Sheikh Fahad will go for about 35 minutes. That will leave us with about 10 minutes for the question and answers, inshallah. So he is, without any further ado, inshallah, he's to start, inshallah.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulih al-Karim amma ba'd. So just give me a second while I share my screen here. And let's see here. Okay, I'm going to ask you guys, let's see here, inshallah. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the screen, the slides. Someone wants to just give me let me know, inshallah.
Yes.
Yes, you can. Okay, wonderful. Okay, let's go ahead and get started, inshallah. So the topic I wanted to discuss today, it's about understanding Islam as a worldview. And this section that I'm going to present, albeit it'll be a bit abbreviated, is part of a course that we do at Sapiens Institute. And this course specifically deals with shubuhat, deals with doubts. And a lot of the doubts that we get on our various platforms. So we have a platform called Lighthouse Mentoring, where we are able to mentor people on a one-on-one basis, and they can come in and ask questions about Islam, doubts that they may be having. And we launched this back in, last Ramadan, and it's just been, it's been very crazy. But that being the case, so we have this Lighthouse Mentoring. It's a one-on-one, mentoring session. It's absolutely free. And through that, we found that there were people that had a plethora of doubts. And preceding that, we had put this course together, which took us about 2 years. So this course is called No Doubt, Finding Certainty in an Age of Uncertainty. And so this will be just a brief section from the course. And I'll give you more information about the course later, bi'idhnillah, if you are interested in it. We have an online version, which just launched, alhamdulillah, 1 hour ago. So let's go ahead and proceed, inshallah. Okay, so I'll give you that information later. Okay, so starting off, a lot of times when people are living in the modern world, and especially young people, they're exposed to a number of different ideologies. And you see a lot of them on the screen in front of you now. So one of the main ones that is proliferating quite quickly is atheism itself. Then you have liberalism, transgenderism, postmodernism, nihilism, feminism, Buchanism, Queerlism. Now, one approach to dealing with all of these ideologies would be to take each approach one by one, dissect each one of these ideologies, and look at what are the problems in these ideologies, whether we're looking at it from a theophilosophical point of view, a moral point of view, or whatever it might be. But frankly, the issue that arises is that what ends up happening is you start playing a game of whack-a-mole. So each ideology that comes up, you'll find, okay, so what we need to have a full analysis of it. What are its historical roots? What is the genealogy of this particular ideology, and so on and so forth? And you're dealing with one issue at a time. So one way of doing that, and that is being done with each one of these, would be to take it one by one. The problem that arises is that what happens when you have new ideologies? What happens when you have things that have come up that we don't know about just yet? So amongst the list that you see up there, I'm sure all of you are familiar with atheism, liberalism, transgenderism. Maybe many of you are familiar with postmodernism, nihilism, feminism. The last two on there, Bukhamism and Kulism, you might not be familiar with. And the reason is because I just made them up, right? There's no such thing as those last two ones on there. But the point is, when the next ideology that comes up, if we keep approaching those just in terms of understanding a particular ideology and then trying to break that down, it's a very long-term and problematic endeavor to do that one at a time. So the approach that we've taken at Sapient specifically is that we want to basically teach people how to fish as opposed to giving them fish. So as you know, the old adage, if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. If you teach a man to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime. So what this course starts off with are foundational elements by which, when someone is exposed to shubuhat and doubts you could say in whatever epoch of time that they're in, because they've understood things from a foundational point of view, they're able to navigate through current ideologies and foreign ideologies and problems and shubuhat, or those that may arise later on. So that being said, inshallah, the course in its entirety covers all of what you see on the screen. So we start off, like I said, on a foundational basis, which is in the section called the metaphysical backdrop. What are those philosophical and actually theological elements that a person needs to have that form the foundations before moving on to specific doubts? So the first section is called the metaphysical backdrop, and that's part of that is what we'll be talking about today. The course itself moves on to then the nature of the heart's main fitan, the sources of doubts, where do shubuhat originate and how, where do they come from? Whether we're looking at it in terms of, how much of how many ex-Muslims are on YouTube and are spreading doubts amongst Muslims and things like that. And then the last part of this course gets into 10 effective strategies to empower a person to be able to deal with their doubts, right? So we're not going to cover all of that today. Today, what we're going to be looking at under the section of the metaphysical backdrop is the first section, which is Islam is not a religion. We'll move from there to what is a worldview and then components of a worldview. And then if we have time, which I don't think I will, but we'll try to get into the limits of rationality and the fitra itself. Now, I guess the good news is I think tomorrow, Dr. Yasser Qadi will be speaking about the fitra as well. So if we don't get to it, hopefully that will be covered in his session. All right, moving on. So let us start. The metaphysical backdrop. Oops. All right, so here's the central thesis of what I wanted to present today. Understanding Islam as a religion leads to and increases doubts about Islam. Therefore, Islam is not a religion. Now, obviously, there's a lot of nuances when we're speaking about the concept of a religion itself. What I'm trying to say in my central thesis is that if we have an understanding of Islam as a religion, as it is understood when people hear the term religion, you find that many aspects of modernity become problematic for someone that's trying to understand their own religion in comparison to what the world around them says. So you find that this tug of war starts to happen because Islam has been put in this box that is defined by not Islam itself, but by kind of secular forces that kind of give it that definition, which we'll get into in a little bit. So there's this tug of war that starts. Now, so looking at the concept of a religion, and if we're going to say that a religion is, let's say, Christianity, it's Buddhism, it's Hinduism, would feminism be considered a religion? Now, most people, if you were to ask them, is feminism a religion? They would probably say, no, feminism is not a religion. And therefore, we shouldn't have any problems accepting feminism because it's not a religion. Islam is a religion. Feminism is something else. So you can have an Islamic feminist, much like you can have an Islamic socialist, an Islamic capitalist, an Islamic, whatever adjective that we make Islam into and then apply it to that, you can have that. But this becomes problematic in a few ways. First of all, if we understand feminism, and I'm taking feminism as an example, so you could apply postmodernism here, liberalism, any of the other isms that I had spoken about earlier. but I'm just using feminism as an example to say, okay, we have an idea about what feminism is. We assume that feminism has to do with women's rights. Now, without getting into the details about first wave feminism, second wave feminism, third wave feminism, feminism at its point, you say, okay, it's about women's rights. Fair enough. Is there anything within feminism that runs antagonist to Islam? Now you might say, well, no, there's nothing wrong with feminism because the idea is it's about women's rights and Islam believes in women's rights. But the thing is, Islam also believes in men's rights, believe it or not. It believes in animal rights and more than anything else, that which is above everything else, which is the rights of Allah. And so therefore, when we look at feminism, we have to say, as a general idea, women's rights is fine, but what are the philosophical underpinnings of the ideology of feminism? What are the philosophical underpinnings? And there are certain assumptions within feminism that run completely antagonist to the Islamic worldview. One of those assumptions is that the human being owns themselves. So you may have seen, maybe feminist protests and things like that and say, my body, my choice, especially related to abortion and things like that. And that philosophical underpinning is that a person owns themselves. In fact, this philosophical underpinning is across the board. When you look at liberalism, postmodernism, transgenderism, that assumption is there. Does that assumption run antagonist to the Islamic worldview? And if you say no, then I'd invite you to go to any sort of, any janaza, anytime someone's at a funeral and hear the words that people are saying. What are they saying? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun, right? To Allah we belong and to Allah is the return. So that base assumption is in fact, it runs antagonist to the Islamic worldview. Why? Because our core understanding of ownership is that Allah owns us, not that we own ourselves. So from this perspective, we would say that there is something, especially when we look at the philosophical underpinnings about feminism, that runs antagonist to Islam. However, when we think about the concept of religion itself, and if feminism is not a religion, we should be able to take Islam, put it in this box called religion, and also, be able to be feminists. And that shouldn't be a problem. And yet you find that it does have a problem. Okay. And by the way, like I said, that was just an example. It's not too, okay. So when it comes to the concept of religion itself, I wanted to highlight one other point, and that is that when we speak about the term religion, and remember my central thesis was Islam is not a religion. But when I say, and if you notice on the slide, I mentioned religion in quotation marks, because when we look at words and where they're used, we see that context becomes extremely important. So if I were to say the word that you see up there, you see the word on there, it's thongs. Imagine now that I said that, let's say we're in the masjid and I say the imam has just walked in and he loves his thongs. Now you may say to me like, wow, that is so rude. I don't even want to, how dare you say that? That's aib, that's disrespectful to the imam of the masjid. Now, if I said that very same statement in Australia, no one would bat an eye. Why? Because thongs in Australia refers to flip-flops. Those sandals you get when you go to Walmart, you buy 50 of them before you go for Hajj or Umrah so that they don't get lost, those things. So depending on your context, the word could mean something completely different. The concept of religion or the word religion, what I'm arguing here is that it's going to be context sensitive. So in one perspective, when we say Islam is not a religion, in certain contexts, that would be an incorrect statement. For instance, in the political sphere in the United States, if we were to take the idea that Islam is not religion literally, then this could have serious ramifications in terms of, socio-political and economic issues that Muslims run into. Because if Islam is not a religion, well, then the concept of religious freedom doesn't apply to Islam, which has ramifications on Muslims, their day-to-day workings, and so on and so forth. In that context, you could say Islam is a religion. But what I'm speaking about here is understanding the concept of religion and how it should be understood versus how it is understood. Okay. And I've divided this up into two ways of understanding religion. One is what we would call a normative understanding, and the other is what we call a descriptive understanding. Now, these particular terms, if you're not familiar with them, normative refers to that as something as it should be understood, while descriptive is about describing a certain situation, right? And you'll see these terms come up in a lot of current day discourse. So, for instance, when someone says that, you know, they may use it with a type of like negative connotation. Like, for instance, if you say I am heteronormative, in other words, I believe it is normal for a man to be with a woman, right, through marriage, whatever it might be, and I believe it is not normal for a man to be with a man or a woman to be with a woman. That would make you hetero, not homo, heteronormative. Similarly, if you were to say that I'm cisnormative, I believe in two distinct genders, and that there's no kind of spectrum of genders. That would make you cisnormative, and so on. In other words, what you consider as something should be, how it should be, and that you consider normal. Whereas if you consider something descriptive, that's something that is just describing, let's say, what you're observing. So if we take like Islam, there's a normative Islam, and then there's a descriptive Islam. There's an Islam as how it should be practiced, what should be believed in. And then there's Islam as it could be described by someone who's outside of the Islamic worldview. So if I say Islam to you, it would have a different connotation because you understand the concept of this is how Islam should be practiced. You should be praying 5 times a day and so on and so forth. You should be good to your neighbors and so on and so forth. If I say the word Islam in, let's say, Midland, Texas, for that person, when they hear the word Islam, they're thinking, oh, these people are just a bunch of terrorists who go around killing people, whatever it might be, right? So we see that there's this distinction, how Islam should be understood, normative, and how, when someone hears it, what they understand with that, descriptive. The term religion itself, you can divide it into these two categories. There is the concept of religion, meaning how it should be understood. And when I say should be understood, I'm talking about the etymological understanding of religion, meaning where does the word religion come from? The original word comes from a Latin origination, and that Latin origination is what you would say religio, which has to do with an obligation. So it linguistically, or rather, when you look at it etymologically, it means to bind. And this was the way religion in the pre-modern times, probably before the 17th century, was understood. In other words, it has some sort of a moral internal code that ties you, let's say, to God, and that God gives you certain rules, and that you're bound to those rules by way of you being a created being. Now, this wasn't limited to the Islamic world. I mean, you have obviously within Christianity, religion was considered, basically something that binds you to God. And again, I'm talking about this from an etymological point of view, right? The word obligation is also tied to that. Okay, so that's what I would say is religion in the normative sense, tying it with the root of the word itself, where it comes from. So in terms of a normative sense, we could say Islam is a religion. In fact, we could say that Islam is most definitely a religion if we're looking at the concept of religion, how it was understood prior to the 17th century in the pre-modern world. However, today, when you say the word religion, from a descriptive point of view, you find that leads to a certain conceptualization of what a religion is. A religion has certain elements, perhaps certain beliefs, but it is still bound and it is still separate from what we call the secular. And so if there is some overlap between religion and the secular, this becomes a bit problematic. Anyway, the point is that if you put Islam in this box that has been defined by the secular world in terms of what is religion, this leads to a certain number of problems. Okay, so now that we've understood religion, let's move forward if this will allow me. There we go. Okay, so if that's the case, what do we mean by the term religion? There's a paper that was written by Rushain Abbasi, and he states in that, and I think this is a good way of kind of summarizing when I was talking about religion being in a box and so on. He says, in the medieval Islamic understanding, it was religion that was regulated and delimited the secular realm. Okay, so you can think of kind of a person's worldview as having two realms, even though that's a very modern conceptualization of a worldview, but nevertheless, two realms: religious realm, secular realm. So what he's saying is that in the pre-modern time, in medieval Islamic understanding, it was religion that regulated and delimited the secular world. What you would consider part of, the secular world, religion defined that. In other words, Islam defined that, rather than the inverse, which, as many scholars have exposed, is central to the function of the secular power in the modern world. So this idea has been flipped in the modern world, in the sense that you have the space of religion, and the boundaries that are given to religion are defined by the secular world. Whereas prior to the 17th century, you find that it was the opposite. Okay, so can we say, and so now going back to what I was mentioning in terms of my thesis, the central thesis here, Islam is not a religion. And remember, I had it in quotes, and I'm speaking about as a descriptive term, not as a normative term. And so Islam is not a religion, and we can see that Islam, in fact, is much more broader. The conceptualization of Islam is much more broader than what we consider religion. If you ask a common person on the street, what is religion? Whatever conceptualization they come up with, Islam is much broader than that. And that's why it gets to be problematic when we try to do a quick translation of the term deen to just mean religion. And I've highlighted one of those issues. So for instance, and as many of you, I'm sure, know about the story of Yusuf alayhi salam in Surah Yusuf, you'll notice at the end, you remember when Yusuf alayhi salam puts the cup in the bag of his brother and so on. And you notice the ayah in the Quran mentions fi din al-malik. And they translate that as he could not have taken his brother within the religion of the king. Now, this really, it doesn't really make sense. Because what does it mean, the religion of the king? Especially from a modern 21st century understanding of religion, it really doesn't make any sense. Why? Because what does the religion of the king have to do with anything? In fact, what this is speaking about is about the system of binding and obligations that the king had put into place, right? The king, when you think about, kingdoms and kingship, that there's a certain law that the king puts in place. And you're bound to that law, right? So you can do this and you can't do this. If you do this, you'll be rewarded. If you do this, you'll be punished. That is what the concept here is referring to when we talk about deen. In fact, even the word deen itself is related to the word dain, as you all know, which has to do with debt. And debt itself has to do with a two-way, a kind of a badal, right? Like an exchange in a sense. So when you give someone something, there's an expectation of return. So that entire concept, when we look at it, if we just say deen is religion, it becomes problematic. And unfortunately, we do a lot of times we just simply translate a word and in which it may not make sense, understanding that the concept of religion as it's understood in the modern world. All right, so you have another ayah here, and that has to do with whoever desires other than Islam and the term here is translated as religion again. All right. وَمَن يَبْتَغِ غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا, whoever desires a religion other than Islam, it will never be accepted from them. Okay, let's go back to our feminism example. Is it acceptable for someone to accept that they own themselves? So think about that for a second. Or is it part and parcel of the Islamic paradigm that we believe that Allah owns us? And will us owning ourselves be acceptable to Allah? It's just something to think about, especially if we consider Islam as a religion in the box that we've put it in, and we say that feminism is not a religion, right? So what I'm proposing is to say the concept of deen is much broader than religion. And so when Allah says that a deen will not be accepted, a deen other than Allah will not be accepted, what we can see is that a deen, this broader conceptualization of what religion is, it's not religion, it's much broader than religion, will definitely have inconsistencies or what we call cracks. And what I mean by that is that those philosophical underpinnings that that particular ideology or quote unquote deen that's other than Islam relies upon is going to be problematic. Okay.
Sheikh Fahad,
Yeah,
just a time check. We have 15 minutes into the presentation,
sounds good.
and we have 10 minutes more. So just wanted to give you a warning.
Gotcha. Jazakallah khair. Okay, one more ayah that I'll look at. So, and this is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, وَالَّذِي أَرْسَلَ رَسُولَهُ بِالْهُدَى وَالدِّينِ الْحَقِّ. It is he who has sent his messenger with guidance and the religion of truth. And to what? To manifest لِيُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى دِينِ كُلِّهِ. Okay, does that mean that Islam that's rooted in truth, right, because it comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will only manifest on falsehood that is in the box of what we call religion? So it's only going to overcome, right, in terms of if you think about the dichotomy between truth and falsehood, is that truth, does that truth only overcome Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, and so on and so forth? Or does it overcome anything foreign to Islam in its entirety? And so here's where I wanted to introduce the idea that when we think about Islam, we shouldn't really call it a religion from the descriptive sense, not from the normative sense. And again, based on context, but rather we should read the concept of deen as being a worldview. So when we talk about a worldview, we see that it's much broader, and a worldview that is not based on truth, a worldview other than Islam is not based on truth. Okay. All right. So then we ask the question, what is a worldview? And simply put, a worldview is basically how you view the world, right? But when we speak about a worldview, and a lot of times we can use the term paradigm, we see that a worldview is basically a person's view of reality. Okay, now I've got up here another kind of quick definition, and this one comes from James Anderson. He says, a person's worldview represents his most fundamental beliefs and assumptions about the universe he inhabits. It reflects how he would answer all of the big questions of human existence. And these are what we call existential questions. Many of us, perhaps because we've been born into an Islamic worldview and an Islamic paradigm, we don't think much about them, right? So when we talk about existential questions or big questions, how did I get here? What am I doing here? And where am I going, right? Like, what is my source? What is my purpose? And what happens at the end when I die? And so he continues, he says, fundamental questions about who or what we are, where we came from, why we're here, where, if anywhere, we're headed, the meaning and purpose of life, the nature of the afterlife, and what counts as a good life here and now. Few people think through these issues in any depth, and fewer still have firm answers to such questions, but a person's worldview will at least incline him towards certain kinds of answers and away from others. So a worldview, just kind of trying to summarize what he's saying, and we'll get into a few more details related to this as well, is that without those quote unquote big questions, a person wouldn't be able to say that that's part of their worldview. Now, sometimes you can hang those questions in abeyance, like I don't know the answers. But even that idea of I don't know the answers is part of a person's worldview. Okay, worldviews shape and inform our experiences of the world around us. Like spectacles of colored lenses, they affect what we see and how we see it. Depending on the color of the lenses, some things may be seen more easily, or conversely may be de-emphasized or distorted. Indeed, some things may not be seen at all. You can think of a worldview as having lenses. Like if you're looking through glasses and the lenses that I have are red, and let's say you have glasses and the glasses that you have and the lenses are green, and you're pointing at a tree and saying, the leaves on that tree are green. And I'm arguing with you incessantly saying, no, the leaves on that tree are red. This is a paradigmatic problem. This is a worldview problem, right? And so what we're saying is that what a worldview is basically how you're looking at reality, how you understand the world around you. And so from there, we see that every single person has a worldview. And this is very important because many times people say, I want to be objective and I'm going to transcend my worldview. I'm going to do it without a worldview. But every person has a worldview. Even someone that claims to not have a worldview In fact, that is part of their worldview, right? So you can think of having a worldview like everyone having a language. Everyone has a language by which they communicate. And so someone can't say, I transcend language. Just doesn't make any sense. Even if that language is not part of sounds that come out and that are interpreted by our ears, they could be sign language. But that ability to communicate is based in a language. And so just like everyone has a language, everyone has a worldview. You cannot be without a worldview. You have to see the world through some lenses. You cannot just take off the glasses, right? And so, and the interesting thing about understanding the world through the concept of worldviews is that you then understand how to understand, you then start to understand worldviews from the perspective of that there can be other worldviews. Okay, so I mentioned everyone has a worldview like everyone has a language. Similarly, everyone has a worldview like everyone has a direction. And just for time's sake, I won't get into this section, but if you're interested, we covered this in the course, and it's about the qibla and the changing of the qibla. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَلِكُلِّ وِجَةٌ هُوَ مُوَلِّيهَا. Everyone has a direction towards which he faces. So although this is specifically talking about the qibla, what's very interesting is that from a 21st century perspective, we find that this issue, like we sometimes we struggle with the idea of like, why would this be problematic? Okay, you're not praying in this direction, you're praying in that direction. Oh, khalas. What's the problem, right? But that's coming from, again, putting Islam as a religion as opposed to putting Islam as a worldview, okay, as a paradigm, as a worldview. Because for the Muslims of Medina at that time, this was part of their worldview, and the direction in which you're facing has to do with a paradigm, not just with something you call a belief or a religion and it's in a box. What's even more fascinating, well, and then there's from the commentary, it is, as commentators point out, an observable fact that every traditional community has had a religious orientation of its own, whether appointed by Allah or chosen by oneself. Your worldview can either be one that you've come up with or human beings have come up with, or it can be a worldview that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, now how I've substantiated that, or why I'm saying that, in the Tafsir Ibn Kathir, Ibn Kathir mentions the ayah itself. He mentions that Ibn Abbas says that, and then he says this last ayah is similar to what Allah has said. لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. To everyone, he's made a law and a method. Now let's stop here just for a second. When we think about how we understand morals and ethics, and that you can have morals and ethics that are, let's say, devoid of a theological basis, in other words, devoid of a God in the picture. So we understand that everyone, just like everyone has a direction in which they turn, everyone also has some sort of ability to understand morals and ethics. But those morals and ethics have something that precedes what you think about a particular idea as being moral or immoral, okay? And that constitutes a part of one's worldview. So worldviews, and this is why he continues, James Anderson, worldviews also largely determine people's opinions on matters of ethics and politics. What a person thinks about abortion, euthanasia, same-sex relationships, environmental ethics, economic policy, public education, and so on will depend upon his underlying worldview more than anything else. So again, just like a person has a direction by which they turn, everyone has a direction. No one can say they're directionless. You can't be, even if you're dead, your face is still pointing in a direction. And that direction, and just like that, everyone has certain ethical and moral ideas, but those ethical and moral ideas are based upon how you're looking at the world. Now, this is probably the main part, and this is probably what I'll cover last, bi'idhnillah, and that is, if we've understood a worldview, and I've rushed through it a little bit, but if we've understood a worldview at this point, we see that it has components, okay? What you see on your screen now, you'll notice a couple of things. First of all, I have components of a worldview, but you notice that they're being shaded lighter and lighter as you go down. So you've got kind of the most important elements of a worldview on top, And then you've got moving down those things that are dependent upon those that are higher up on this somewhat of a hierarchy of components of a worldview. So what you'll notice is that morality and ethics isn't the first thing, but it comes much later on. It depends upon other elements of your worldview. So let's go through them briefly. Number one is ontology. So this is the question about what exists. Do I exist? Does the mouse that I'm using exist? Does the screen exist? Does the tree outside exist? So these are ontological questions about being. So what exists? From there, you get, does God exist? Which takes us to a theology. And so then you get into who is God and so on and so forth. An ontology then is dependent upon an epistemology. How do you know what is true? How do you determine truth? What is knowledge? What is truth? And so from an Islamic worldview, we see that sources of knowledge are revelation and the natural world. From other worldviews, that may be different. You then have anthropology, and I'll finish up with this, Brother Sadiq. Just give me 2 more minutes, inshallah. So then you have an anthropology about who or what is the human being. Is the human being a soul and a body, or is it just material matter? If it's just material matter, how do you explain consciousness? How do you explain morality, and so on and so forth? Once we have that, we see that there's we move on to teleology. Is there a purpose? Does the universe have a purpose? Do I have a purpose? What is the meaning of my life? After all of that, then you come to morality and ethics. What is right? What is wrong? What do I consider moral? What do I consider immoral? From there, then you move on to, you derive from there, law and politics. What is just law? What is politically correct? And the last part I have on there, which is aesthetics, which many of us don't really think about. And then this will be the last point I'll make, that aesthetic, when we think about what is beautiful and what is not beautiful, our worldview can sometimes determine that. So just an example, if I said the word art, most people think about visual arts, right? When you think art, you think, okay, paintings, sculptures, but that is that comes from a very Judeo-Christian understanding of the world, because from actually not even Judeo-Christian, but a Christian understanding of the world. Why? Because from a Christian worldview, the word becomes flesh. And so throughout Europe and throughout, when Christianity was spreading, the concept of the body and visual arts and things like that became, proliferated. So much so that that's part of the modern world as well, such that when we hear art or the word art, we immediately think about visual art. Whereas in the Islamic paradigm, in the pre-modern world, you think about art and you think about the idea of beauty, it's more tied to the oratory experience. And so that's why we think about the Quran, the recitation of the Quran. When we consider beauty, we look at calligraphy and things like that, right? So aesthetics plays a part of one's worldview. So in summary, when we speak about the concept of Islam, to understand it just as a religion puts it in a box, which becomes a means to people to doubt Islam as well, because it starts to run antagonist to other conceptualizations of the world. However, when we understand it from a paradigmatic perspective, from a worldview perspective, we find that this is in fact liberating. And I can say this firsthand experience, with sessions we've had on Lighthouse Mentoring and so on and so forth. When a person truly understands Islam as a worldview, or as a paradigm that's encompassing and includes these components, and that ethics and morals and things like that are based upon many things that precede it, it's empowering for many Muslims that are going through doubts and things like that. So I'll go ahead and stop here. I know I've gone a little bit over my time, so Jazakallah khair, Brother Sadiq.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Fahad. We really appreciate your insight here and the wisdom you have shared with us. Inshallah, we're going to open it now for a few questions. Maybe we'll have 10 minutes for the question. We'll extend the session maybe 5 minutes because we started late. So please feel free to share some. So I do see a comment here. So atheism is a religion, right? That is what I always felt, but was not sure how to support that. This helps.
So again, it depends on what we mean by the term religion. I would say religion, if you ask most people in terms of a descriptive understanding of religion, they would not consider atheism as a religion. However, again, what I mentioned was that we're not trying to put Islam in a box to say, okay, like Islam is a religion, atheism is something else, because clearly Islam has something to say against atheism. So it kind of, and hopefully what I was trying to get through this presentation was the understanding of religion itself. Atheism, if we look at it from, when I was talking about the etymology of the word religion, it actually doesn't bind you to anything. So in terms of a moral code, what are you bound to? You're bound to nothing. And by the way, if you think about it, even from anthropology, who or what is a man? If you consider the material world and the human being is just material body, this leads to problems with valuation as well. How do you value a human being? If there's no soul, there's no God, what sort of valuation do we have? These concepts are prior to the 17th century, what we would call religious concepts. But in the modern discourse, atheism, if you told that to most people, they wouldn't accept that that's a religion. And hence why I'm saying we need to kind of broaden the conversation when it comes to Islam and say, no, Islam is not a religion from that perspective, but rather Islam is much broader than that. It's a worldview and it's a paradigm. And this can also, by the way, be effective when people say, I don't believe in organized religions, right? Like it's a very easy kind of fix to say, well, yeah, from that perspective, Islam isn't a religion. It's much broader than that. Allahu ta'ala alim.
Jazakallah khair. There's another question that came, Sheikh Fahad. You want to take a look at it, please?
Let's see. So atheism, let's see. Does the worldview paradigm as understood through the written word extend from the ideas and writings of Wittgenstein? So as far as I know, Wittgenstein, and this maybe goes back to the section where I was talking about religion as normative and religion as descriptive. So Wittgenstein had this idea that, and his area that I'm at least familiar with was that of the philosophy of language, where he, and many people say that his ideas were very similar to Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas in this regard, that words are context sensitive. And so hence, if there's no context, there's no way really to understand a word. And so that's why I was saying the concept of religion depends on the context. If we're using it from the idea of, the political state of Muslims in America, then from that context, we're talking about religion in terms of religious freedom. However, if we're looking at it as how do we understand the world around us, then that context is different. And Wittgenstein had basically, mentioned some of those elements. And I think that's what you're referring to, if I'm not mistaken.
So we have another question, but before that, I would like to encourage the audience, please, to take the time to fill the survey that I've shared in the chat room. There is a specific section for this session, so feel free to fill this information so we can, improve for the future, inshallah. So there's another question. Feel free to take it,
Sure.
Sheikh Fahad.
So in the Islamic worldview, you said part of our epistemology is the natural world. Would revelation not be the sole source of knowledge? The natural world and realities we see from nature are elements explained in revelation. Okay, excellent question. So let me just answer that with a caveat. And that is that keep in mind that a lot of this content I did rush through a little bit. So if you are interested in having a kind of a broader explanation more on the content, I've got some things on the screen. We just, like I said, a few hours ago, launched our online platform, which has the whole course on it that, I was actually able to go out and record it. So feel free to take a look at those resources as well. So coming back to your question, from a part of our epistemology is that we believe in revelation and the natural world. So it's not, and later on in the slides, I talk about the comparison between the modern worldview and the Islamic worldview from epistemology. In fact, if I can see if I can bring that slide up, which may kind of here. So you notice that I've got on there revelation, Quran, Sunnah, Islamic worldview. It's not part of the modern worldview. Sense experience, his. This is both part of the Islamic worldview and part of the modern worldview as well. Reason, aql, again, part of the modern worldview and part of the Islamic worldview. And then we have other elements that more or less, may be mirrored in one way or another. From our worldview, we have the concept of that. You mentioned that would revelation not be the sole source of knowledge? And in fact, no, it wouldn't. Because think of it this way. How do we know what we know? Or let's take a very simple example. How do we know, maybe this is not a very simple example. How do we know it's time for Maghrib? Right? Usually back in the day, they would look out into the natural world and see, okay, the sun is setting. So that becomes a source of knowledge in order for us to understand the revelation, what we're supposed to do, and so on and so forth. So that's why we say that our sources of knowledge are revelation, the Quran and the Sunnah, and the natural world as well. Now, there's a whole discussion on, which one takes precedence, so on and so forth, and it gets into like concepts of the aql and the naql, which we get into a little bit in the course. But, as far as your question, it's not the sole source of knowledge. And in fact, it can't be. Even in order for us to, in order for us to take part in the acts of worship, we still need knowledge from the natural world. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Fahad. We can take one more question.
Okay.
It looks like we have one.
This is
maybe a comment, yeah.
Comment. Okay, so reminder to myself, 33, 36, when Allah and His Messenger have decided on a matter that concerns them, it is not fitting for any believing man or woman to claim freedom of choice in that matter. Whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger is far astray. Jazakallah khair. By the way, when you go through the concept of worldviews and you start reading the Quran, it's a different dynamic. From personal experience, that's, you start looking at things like, wow, yeah, I mean, Islam is much broader than just a religion. And ayats like the ones that you mentioned and others really start hitting home in a very different way. Allahu ta'ala.
Okay, Jazakumullah khair. In the absence of any more questions, I would like to bring this session to a conclusion. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Fahad. I would like to encourage all the audience, inshallah, to join me for an extension of this session titled Making Islam Relevant to Our Students by Sheikh Suhaib Webb. That's going to be starting, inshallah, in about 14 minutes. It's going to be 11:05 Pacific Standard Time, 2:05 Eastern Standard Time. So inshallah, we see you shortly. Jazakumullah khair and enjoy your break. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.